I've been living a financial lie for the past 3 years, and today I'm finally coming clean. This secret has cost me over $15,000 and countless sleepless nights. Before I discovered the 50-30-20 rule, I was drowning in credit card debt while posting luxury vacations on Instagram. If you've ever felt trapped by your finances, you're not alone. And what I'm about to share changed everything for me. My financial breaking point. Have you ever felt like you're drowning in a financial secret that's eating you alive? That was me 3 years ago. I still remember that night vividly. It was supposed to be a casual Friday dinner with friends at our favorite restaurant. The kind of place where the bill never exceeds $20 per person, yet somehow feels like a treat. I ordered what I always did, the chicken pasta and a glass of house wine. Nothing extravagant, nothing that should have been a problem. But when the server ran my card, she returned with that look. You know the one. The awkward half smile that says, "I have bad news, but I'm trying to be professional about it." She leaned in close to my ear and whispered those 5 devastating words, "Your card has been declined." My stomach dropped. The restaurant suddenly felt too hot, too loud. I fumbled through my wallet, knowing full well that every other card was maxed out. My friend Alex noticed something was wrong and asked what happened. I tried to laugh it off. Oh, must be a problem with their system. But my voice cracked. After a painful minute of pretending to search for another payment option, I had to do the unthinkable. I had to turn to Alex and ask, "Hey, could you cover me tonight? I'll Venmo you right away." The shame burned through me like acid. Not because Alex wouldn't help, he immediately said, "No problem," but because I knew there was no money to Venmo him. And what made it infinitely worse? Just 2 weeks earlier, I'd posted photos from my weekend getaway to Miami. A trip I couldn't afford. A trip charged entirely to one of my 5 credit cards. As Alex paid the bill, my phone lit up with Instagram notifications. People still liking those beach photos, those fancy cocktails, that hotel room with the ocean view. If they only knew that behind that carefully curated highlight reel was a financial nightmare. Over $15,000 in credit card debt, spread across 5 different cards. The contrast was destroying me. My social media showed someone living their best life, while in reality, I couldn't even cover a $60 dinner. I was working what most would consider a decent job as a marketing coordinator. On paper, I should have been fine, but somehow I was spending nearly double what I was bringing home. I'd become trapped in the psychological quicksand of financial appearances. Each time I'd get paid, I'd immediately allocate money toward things that maintained the illusion. The right clothes, the right restaurants, the weekend trips that would make for perfect social media content. I convinced myself these expenses were investments in my personal brand, in networking, and future opportunities. But they were just desperate attempts to keep up with a standard of living I thought I deserved but couldn't actually afford. The worst part wasn't even the debt itself. It was the constant, exhausting performance. The mental energy required to track which cards still had available credit, which bills I could delay, which friends I'd already borrowed from. I became a financial juggler, but the balls were getting heavier, and I was running out of hands. Back in my apartment that night, after the restaurant incident, I finally did what I'd been avoiding for months. I laid out all 5 credit card statements on my kitchen table. I still remember how my hands shook as I arranged them in a row. Each statement told the same story, maxed out or nearly maxed out limits, with minimum payments that barely touched the principal. The numbers were horrifying. One card had an interest rate of 24.99%. I was paying almost $200 a month just in interest. Another had late fees that had accumulated to the point where my minimum payment was higher than what I'd actually spent that month. I took a photo of this shameful display, partly as documentation, partly as a wake-up call to myself. That photo still exists on my phone, though I've blurred the account numbers in the version I sometimes show others now. The physical toll this financial secret took on me was something I wasn't prepared for. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Ironic, given all the actual luxuries I was charging. I'd lay awake until 3 or 4 a.m., mentally calculating and recalculating, trying to find mathematical solutions that simply didn't exist. Checking my bank account triggered immediate panic attacks. My heart would race, my palms would sweat, and sometimes I'd have to sit down on the floor right there in my apartment until the dizziness passed. My stomach was in a constant state of knots. I developed what my doctor later called stress-induced gastritis. Essentially, my financial anxiety was eating away at my stomach lining, just as surely as my debt was eating away at my future. I became a master at avoiding mail. I knew what was in those envelopes: more statements, more minimum payments, more evidence of my failure. I'd stack them unopened on my kitchen counter until the pile became so tall it would tip over, forcing me to at least relocate them to a drawer. Out of sight, out of mind, except they were never out of mind. The restaurant incident became my breaking point. Not because it was financially significant, $60 was a drop in the ocean of my debt, but because it shattered the illusion I'd worked so hard to maintain. It forced me to acknowledge that I couldn't keep pretending. The gap between my real financial situation and the life I was projecting had grown too wide to straddle anymore. That night, sitting among the scattered credit card statements, something shifted. The shame was still there, but alongside it was something new, a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't expending energy on maintaining the lie. I had hit rock bottom, and it was terrible, but it was also solid. There was nowhere further to fall. I didn't know it then, but that moment, that painful, humiliating breaking point, was actually the first step toward recovery. It was the moment I finally admitted to myself that I needed help, that I couldn't solve this alone, that something fundamental had to change. The truth is, you can't fix what you refuse to acknowledge. My financial recovery couldn't begin until I was willing to look at the full extent of the damage without flinching, without making excuses, without telling myself comforting lies about how things would somehow work out. In that moment, surrounded by the paper evidence of my financial chaos, I made a promise to myself. Not that I would pay off all my debt immediately. That wasn't realistic. Not that I would never make another financial mistake. That wasn't honest. The promise was simpler and more fundamental. I would stop lying. To myself, to others, about money. It wasn't an overnight transformation. I didn't wake up the next morning financially responsible and debt-free. But that night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The chapter where I stopped drowning and started, however awkwardly, to swim toward shore. The double burden, debt and mental health. That first awkward stroke toward shore came with a realization I never expected. My financial problems were literally rewiring my brain. The crushing weight of my debt had become a shadow that followed me everywhere, triggering waves of anxiety that crashed over me at the most unexpected moments. What I didn't understand yet was that my financial crisis and deteriorating mental health weren't just happening at the same time. They were actually feeding each other in a vicious cycle that felt impossible to break. The worst part wasn't just having money problems, it was feeling like I had to face them completely alone. I'd built this image as someone who had their financial life together. My friends would actually come to me for budgeting advice. Can you imagine the irony? There I was, drowning in debt while dispensing financial wisdom like some kind of money guru. The shame of admitting I was a fraud felt worse than the debt itself. So I kept it hidden. I smiled through brunch while my stomach churned with anxiety about the transaction that would hit my account. I nodded knowingly during conversations about investing while mentally calculating if I could make minimum payments that month. Every day became an exhausting performance, where I played the role of financially stable adult while backstage my life was falling apart. The isolation was suffocating. Each time a friend suggested a night out, I'd run calculations in my head about how to appear normal without spending money I didn't have. I'd become a master of excuses. Oh, I'm trying this new budgeting challenge, or I'm saving for something big. Anything to hide the truth. The more I lied, the more alone I felt, and the harder it became to reach out for help. What I didn't realize then was that I was part of a silent epidemic. Nearly 25% of millennials have reported feeling physically ill due to financial stress, and over half have experienced depression related to their financial situations. I wasn't a uniquely terrible person with no self-control. I was experiencing something millions of others were going through too. The physical toll was becoming impossible to ignore. I developed persistent headaches that no amount of painkillers seemed to touch. My sleep patterns became erratic, lying awake until 3 a.m. obsessively running numbers in my head, then dragging myself through the next day in a fog of exhaustion. The chronic stress was taking a measurable toll on my body. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, this kind of ongoing financial stress can lead to serious health complications like heart disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes if left unchecked. My brain felt like it was operating in slow motion. Simple decisions became paralyzing. I'd stand in grocery store aisles for minutes, frozen with anxiety over whether I could afford to buy name-brand pasta sauce. Research shows this isn't just psychological. Financial stress physically alters brain function, affecting decision-making abilities and emotional regulation. My brain was literally working against me, trapped in a stress response that made rational financial choices even harder. I created a timeline once, mapping my mental health against my growing debt. The correlation was striking. As my credit card balances climbed, my mental health plummeted in almost perfect synchronicity. Each major debt increase was followed by a noticeable dip in my well-being. The month I opened my 5th credit card coincided with my first full-blown panic attack in the checkout line at Target. These weren't separate problems, they were two sides of the same coin. My financial stress was triggering anxiety and depression, which led to poor financial decisions, like comfort spending or avoiding my bills, which created more financial stress. Around and around it went, each problem making the other worse. My work started to suffer too. I'd sit at my desk staring blankly at my computer screen, unable to focus as financial worries consumed my thoughts. My manager noticed my declining performance and scheduled a check-in that I dreaded for days. I blamed it on personal issues. Technically true, but nowhere near the whole story. The irony was painful. My deteriorating work performance threatened the very income I desperately needed to address my debt. My relationships frayed at the edges. I started declining social invitations, partly to avoid spending money, but mostly because maintaining the facade of financial stability had become too exhausting. Friends noticed my withdrawal but didn't understand the cause. "You never hang out anymore," they'd text, and I'd invent excuses rather than admit the truth. The isolation only deepened my depression, creating yet another negative cycle. Even basic self-care fell by the wayside. I skipped dental appointments because I couldn't afford them, ignored minor health issues hoping they'd resolve on their own, and subsisted on the cheapest food options regardless of nutritional value. I knew these choices would likely cost me more in the long run, but when you're drowning in financial anxiety, long-term thinking feels like an impossible luxury. The turning point came unexpectedly. I was scrolling through articles about managing debt late one night, my regular 2 a.m. anxiety ritual, when I stumbled across research about the relationship between financial problems and mental health. The article discussed how financial difficulties are a common cause of stress and anxiety, with stigma around debt often leading to isolation and reluctance to seek help, exactly what I had been experiencing. For the first time, I saw my situation through a different lens. This wasn't just about my inability to manage money. There were larger forces at play: predatory lending practices, inadequate financial education, societal pressure to project success, and the very real physical and psychological effects of financial stress. Understanding these connections didn't immediately fix my problems, but it gave me something invaluable. It helped me stop blaming myself entirely for what was happening. I realized I'd been viewing my financial struggles as evidence of some fundamental character flaw, that I was irresponsible, undisciplined, or somehow morally failing. Learning about the intrinsic link between financial problems and mental health helped me develop a more compassionate view of my situation. I wasn't just bad with money, I was caught in a complex web of financial and psychological factors that would require more than just budgeting to address. This new understanding became crucial to my recovery. Instead of seeing myself as a failure who kept making bad choices, I began to recognize how anxiety was distorting my thinking and decision-making. I could acknowledge the real external pressures that had contributed to my situation without absolving myself of responsibility. Most importantly, I could see that recovering would require addressing both the financial and mental health aspects of my situation. I remember sitting on my bed surrounded by past due notices and feeling, for the first time in months, a glimmer of hope. Not because my situation had changed, it hadn't, but because I finally understood what I was dealing with. It wasn't just about paying off debt, it was about healing my relationship with money and with myself. The stigma around both financial struggles and mental health issues creates a particularly toxic combination. We're expected to be financially successful while simultaneously maintaining perfect mental health, and to do it all without ever admitting to difficulties. Breaking free from that impossible standard was my first real step toward recovery. I started small. I told one friend, just one, the truth about my situation. I chose someone I trusted completely, rehearsed what I would say for days, and still nearly backed out at the last minute. When I finally managed to get the words out, her response changed everything. Instead of judgment, she offered understanding. Instead of advice, she offered support. And instead of seeing me differently, she thanked me for trusting her enough to be honest. That single conversation created a tiny crack in the wall of shame I'd built around myself. Through that crack, a bit of light began to shine. Maybe I wasn't alone. Maybe I wasn't beyond help. Maybe there was a way forward that I just couldn't see yet. The financial problems were still there. The anxiety was still there. But something fundamental had shifted. I had stopped hiding, at least with one person, and the world hadn't ended. That gave me the courage to take the next step, and the next. My failed attempts at financial recovery. That courage to take the next step led me straight into what I call my financial rehab experiments. A series of budgeting attempts so spectacularly unsuccessful, they deserve their own tragic comedy special. What makes a financial system actually stick when willpower alone isn't enough? After my confession to my friend, I was determined to fix my finances immediately. And by immediately, I mean I went home that night and created the most restrictive budget known to humanity. My first brilliant plan: cut out literally everything that wasn't absolutely necessary for survival. No eating out, no shopping, no entertainment, just rent, utilities, minimum debt payments, and ramen noodles. I lasted exactly 9 days before I cracked. On day 10, I walked past my favorite coffee shop feeling proud of my restraint, then caught a whiff of their seasonal latte. 20 minutes later, I was sitting there with not just a $6 coffee, but also a $4 pastry and a new $25 mug I didn't need. That tiny slip turned into, well, I've already failed today, which spiraled into a weekend-long spending bender that left me feeling worse than when I started. This cycle might sound familiar if you've ever tried crash dieting. I'd restrict myself to the point of misery, inevitably break down and overspend, then punish myself with even stricter limitations. With each failure, my self-esteem plummeted further. According to the research I later discovered, this pattern is incredibly common. People who abandon budgeting plans after making a single mistake fall into the same psychological trap as crash dieters. One slip-up becomes an excuse to throw the entire plan out the window. Not willing to give up, I dove into the world of budgeting systems. First up, the cash envelope method. I withdrew my entire paycheck in cash and sorted it into labeled envelopes for different spending categories. This method has worked wonders for many people, but for someone as disorganized as me, disaster. Within 2 weeks, I had misplaced my groceries envelope containing $200. I found it 3 months later when cleaning under my car seat, but by then I'd given up on the system entirely. Next, I created an elaborate color-coded spreadsheet that tracked every penny going in and out. It had formulas, conditional formatting, and graphs that would make an accountant weep with joy. It was beautiful. It was comprehensive. And I abandoned it after 4 days because updating it required more mental energy than I had after work. Every time I made a purchase, I'd think, I'll add it to the spreadsheet when I get home, and then never did. Soon I was weeks behind, facing a mountain of receipts and zero motivation to catch up. Desperate for a solution, I downloaded 6 different budgeting apps. 6. Each promised to revolutionize my finances with minimal effort. The problem? Every purchase triggered a notification. You've spent 80% of your restaurant budget. Warning, grocery spending exceeds target. My phone became a pocket-sized guilt machine. I started avoiding looking at it altogether, which defeated the entire purpose. The emotional roller coaster was exhausting. Each new system began with so much hope. This time would be different. This was the solution I'd been waiting for. I'd imagined myself debt-free, financially secure, telling my success story to others. Then reality would hit. The system would prove too rigid, too complex, or too time-consuming, and I'd spiral into frustration and shame. Why couldn't I stick with anything? What was wrong with me? What I didn't understand then was that over 50% of young adults struggle with financial literacy. I wasn't alone in my struggles. I was actually part of a much larger statistic. My budgeting failures weren't just about lack of discipline. They reflected a genuine skill gap that nobody had ever taught me to fill. The breaking point came after my fourth failed attempt when I realized something crucial. I was aiming for perfection instead of progress. One survey showed that financial perfectionism is one of the biggest saboteurs of budgeting efforts. I was embodying this completely. One small mistake, and I'd declare the entire system a failure. I was treating my budget like an all-or-nothing proposition instead of a flexible guide. I remember sitting on my bedroom floor surrounded by printouts of failed budgets, abandoned tracking sheets, and unused cash envelopes. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent money on supplies for budgeting systems that were supposed to help me save money, only to abandon them all. That's when I had my first real breakthrough. I didn't need the perfect system. I needed a sustainable one. This revelation shifted everything. I started asking different questions. Not, what's the most effective budgeting system? But, what's a budgeting system I'll actually stick with? Not, how can I cut every unnecessary expense? But how can I create balance while still making progress? The problem wasn't that I lacked willpower. It was that I kept choosing systems that required superhuman levels of discipline and perfection. My extreme approaches were doomed from the start. Research shows that extreme budgeting methods, like cutting out all discretionary spending, typically lead to burnout and eventual overspending, exactly what happened to me. I was setting myself up for failure by creating unsustainable restrictions that no human could reasonably maintain long-term. I also realized I was making another common mistake, trying to live way below my means after years of living beyond them. The psychological whiplash was too severe. According to financial behavior experts, sustainable change requires moderate adjustments rather than extreme ones. I needed to find middle ground. My tracking experiments taught me something valuable too. While my elaborate spreadsheets were too cumbersome, the research I later found confirmed that people who track their spending in some form are much more likely to develop positive financial habits. The key wasn't abandoning tracking altogether, but finding a tracking method that fit my personality and lifestyle. Another hard lesson came from realizing how much my finances were tied to my social identity. I was trying to implement strict budgeting while still maintaining appearances with friends. The research on young adults living beyond their means to keep up with peers described my situation perfectly. I couldn't succeed financially while still trying to project the same lifestyle that got me into trouble. These failures, frustrating as they were, weren't wasted time. Each attempt taught me something crucial about myself and what I needed from a financial system. The cash envelopes showed me I needed digital solutions. The spreadsheet taught me I needed simplicity. The apps demonstrated I needed encouragement, not just warnings. And the extreme budgeting revealed I needed flexibility and room for occasional pleasures. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that 70% of college students report feeling overwhelmed by financial responsibilities, a statistic that made me feel less alone in my struggles. My avoidance behaviors weren't unique to me. They were common responses to financial stress. Understanding this helped me stop viewing my difficulties as character flaws and start seeing them as challenges to overcome. All these failed attempts were actually guiding me toward what would eventually work. I needed a system that was simple enough to remember, flexible enough to accommodate real life, and forgiving enough that a single mistake wouldn't derail my entire journey. I needed balance, a turning point, finding the 50-30-20 rule. Balance in what feels like chaos. That's what I was searching for during those late-night internet spirals. While drowning in spreadsheets and failed budgeting attempts, the financial lifeline I needed was hiding in plain sight. The solution that finally worked for me came from the most unexpected place. A random comment on a Reddit thread at 2 a.m. when I had almost given up hope. I remember that night vividly. After another day of avoiding my creditors' calls and staring at my collection of failed budget templates, I found myself in the familiar territory of sleepless anxiety. But instead of just worrying, I started scrolling through financial advice forums, desperately hoping for anything, that might actually work for someone as financially disastrous as me. That's when I saw it. A comment buried deep in a thread about budgeting failures. Stop overcomplicating it. Just try the 50-30-20 rule. It saved my sanity and my credit score. The comment had hundreds of upvotes and dozens of replies thanking the original poster. I was immediately intrigued but skeptical. How could something with such a simple name possibly address the complex financial mess I'd created? The commenter explained the concept in just 3 sentences. 50% of your after-tax income goes to needs: housing, groceries, utilities, minimum debt payments. 30% goes to wants: eating out, entertainment, hobbies. 20% goes to savings and additional debt payments beyond the minimums. That was it. No complicated spreadsheets, no micromanaging every penny, just 3 percentages to remember. My first thought was, this is too simplistic to work. After all, I had tried elaborate budgeting systems with dozens of categories. I downloaded apps that required me to log every purchase. I'd created color-coded spreadsheets that would make any financial advisor proud before abandoning them all. But there was something immediately appealing about this approach. Unlike my previous attempts that cut out every enjoyable expense, the 50-30-20 rule actually acknowledged that I deserved to spend some money on things that brought me joy. It gave me permission to allocate 30% of my income to wants without guilt. After months of financial self-flagellation, this felt almost revolutionary. Still, I had serious doubts. Would this really work for someone with my level of debt? Most budgeting advice I'd found seemed designed for people who were already financially stable, not those who were drowning. I scrolled through the comments, looking for someone in a situation similar to mine. What I found was encouraging. People with significant debt were sharing success stories. One comment particularly stood out. I had $23 in credit card debt and thought I'd never see the light. The 50-30-20 rule gave me a framework that was actually sustainable. 2 years later, I'm almost debt-free. It wasn't quick, but it was doable. That comment hit me hard. Doable was exactly what I needed. Not miraculous, not instant, just doable. Maybe the problem with my previous attempts wasn't that they weren't thorough enough, but that they were too complicated to maintain. The more I read about the 50-30-20 rule, the more I realized its genius wasn't in its mathematical precision, but in its psychological approachability. Research backs this up. The simplicity of the 50-30-20 rule enhances adherence, as individuals find it easier to remember and implement compared to more complex budgeting systems. This ease of use is particularly beneficial for young adults who may be new to managing their finances, people exactly like me. What really sold me was reading that the rule could be adjusted based on individual circumstances. Experts suggest that the 50-30-20 rule can be adjusted based on individual circumstances, such as higher living costs in urban areas, which may require reallocating percentages to better fit personal financial situations. It wasn't rigid. It was a starting point that I could personalize. I also discovered something that addressed my biggest struggle, the mental health aspect of financial recovery. The effectiveness of the 50-30-20 rule is supported by its ability to foster a sense of control over finances, which can alleviate financial anxiety and improve overall mental health, as individuals feel more empowered in their financial decisions. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about regaining control and improving my well-being. There was another compelling point, A study by the National Endowment for Financial Education found that young adults who receive financial education, including budgeting strategies like the 50-30-20 rule, are less likely to engage in detrimental financial practices such as maxing out credit cards. Maybe, if I had learned this years ago, I wouldn't be in this position, but it wasn't too late to change course. Before closing my laptop that night, I made a decision. I would give the 50-30-20 rule a chance. Not for a week or even a month, but commit to it for at least 3 months, long enough to see if it could actually make a difference. I took a screenshot of the Reddit comment that started it all. I still have it, username blurred of course, as a reminder of where this journey began. The next morning I created a simple document with 3 columns: needs, 50%, wants, 30%, and savings, debt, 20%. No subcategories, no complex formulas, just those 3 buckets to start. I calculated what these percentages meant for my monthly take-home pay. 50% for needs, 30% for wants, $1,110, 20% for savings debt, $740. Looking at these numbers, I had my first moment of clarity in months. I'd been spending way more than $1,110 on wants. In fact, my wants had been consuming nearly all my income, forcing me to use credit cards for basic needs. Seeing these limits in black and white made me realize how unsustainable my lifestyle had been. But instead of feeling restricted by these numbers, I felt strangely liberated. For the first time, I had permission to spend $110 every month on things I enjoyed, guilt-free. I didn't have to track every coffee purchase or beat myself up for buying lunch occasionally. As long as I stayed within that 30% bucket, I was on track. Even more powerful was seeing that $740 number for debt repayment. It wasn't enough to wipe out my debt overnight, but it was substantial enough to make real progress each month. For the first time, I could envision a path forward. What made this approach different from my previous attempts wasn't just its simplicity, it was the balance it offered. My previous budgets had been all about restriction, while my spending habits had been all about indulgence. The 50-30-20 rule offered a middle path that acknowledged both my needs and my wants, while still making progress toward my financial goals. I decided to take it one day at a time. I didn't rush out to buy any special budgeting tools or apps. I simply used the Notes app on my phone to track which category each expense belonged to and kept a running total. At the end of each week, I'd transfer these notes to my simple 3-column document to see how I was tracking against my percentages. The first month was revealing. I quickly discovered that my needs were actually exceeding 50% of my income, primarily because of my housing costs and minimum debt payments. This was a reality check. But instead of abandoning the system as not working for me, I made an adjustment. I could temporarily use a 60-20-20 split until I could reduce some fixed expenses. What surprised me most was how quickly I adapted to living within the 20% wants category. Rather than feeling deprived, I became more intentional about what I chose to spend that money on. Instead of mindless purchases that gave me momentary satisfaction, I started prioritizing experiences and items that brought genuine joy. The most satisfying part was watching that 20% for debt repayment actually making a dent in my balances. Each month, as I paid more than the minimums, I could see the totals decreasing. It wasn't fast, but it was happening. The 50-30-20 rule worked because it was simple enough to remember, flexible enough to adapt to my situation, and balanced enough to be sustainable. I didn't need fancy tools or complicated systems. I just needed a framework that acknowledged the reality of my life while still moving me toward financial health. Breaking down my 50-30-20 implementation. The framework made perfect sense in theory, but what happened when I applied it to my actual spending? Let me take you through what was honestly the most eye-opening financial experience of my life. Looking at my finances through the 50-30-20 lens revealed I'd been living in a complete fantasy world about where my money was actually going. First, I needed to get brutally honest with myself. I gathered every bank statement, credit card bill, and receipt I could find from the past 3 months. I created a simple spreadsheet with 3 columns: needs, wants, and savings debt. This was the moment of truth. Time to categorize every single transaction. But here's where things got uncomfortable. I kept finding myself trying to justify obvious luxuries as necessities. That $45 dinner? I needed to eat. My premium streaming subscriptions? Basic entertainment is essential. The rideshare trips when I could have taken the bus? It was raining that day. When I finally forced myself to be honest about what truly constituted a need versus a want, the numbers were shocking. I discovered I was spending a staggering 85% of my income on wants, while only 15% went toward actual needs. And savings? Absolutely zero. No wonder I was drowning in debt. The reality check was humbling. Housing, basic groceries, utilities, minimum debt payments, and transportation to work were really the only things that qualified as genuine needs. Everything else, the restaurant meals, the impulse Amazon purchases, the expensive coffee habit, those were all wants masquerading as needs in my mind. I created a proper 50-30-20 budget based on my actual take-home pay. For the first time, I could visualize what a balanced financial life might look like. The contrast between my actual spending and this new plan was stark. I was going to need to make some serious changes. To make this work practically, I broke down each category into specific subcategories. Under needs, I included rent, utilities, basic groceries, insurance, and minimum debt payments. Wants encompassed dining out, entertainment, shopping, and any grocery items that weren't basic necessities, like fancy snacks or alcohol. The savings debt category was initially focused entirely on extra debt payments with a small emergency fund allocation. I realized I needed a tracking system that wouldn't overwhelm me. Previous attempts at financial tracking had me obsessively checking every penny multiple times daily, a habit that quickly led to burnout. Instead, I opted for a simple note-taking app on my phone where I recorded expenses throughout the day. Once a week, Sunday morning with coffee, I'd transfer everything to my budget spreadsheet and assess my progress. This weekly check-in became critical to my success. I wasn't just tracking numbers. I was learning to identify patterns and triggers in my spending. I noticed I tended to overspend on Fridays after a stressful work week, or that I'd make impulse purchases when browsing online while bored. These insights helped me develop strategies to avoid these pitfalls. The pay-yourself-first approach revolutionized how I handled the savings portion of my budget. Instead of waiting to see what was left at the end of the month, spoiler, it was always zero, I immediately transferred my 20% allocation to debt repayment as soon as I got paid. This simple switch made an enormous difference. What was out of sight truly became out of mind. Implementing this system required some difficult decisions. I had to be honest with myself about needs I'd been overinflating. My apartment was well above the recommended 30% of income for housing. My car payment was excessive. My grocery bill included way too many convenience foods and impulse purchases. Each of these realizations meant I needed to make changes that wouldn't be easy. One incredibly helpful technique was using the envelope method for categories where I tended to overspend. For things like groceries and entertainment, I'd withdraw the exact cash amount budgeted and place it in labeled envelopes. When the envelope was empty, that was it until the next budget period. This tangible limitation helped train my spending habits far better than digital tracking alone. Using budgeting tools made the process much more manageable. While I had tried complex apps before, this time I stuck with a simpler approach. A basic spreadsheet tracked my overall budget, while my phone's note app captured daily expenses. This combination provided structure without overwhelming me with notifications and reminders that had triggered anxiety in the past. The most eye-opening part was distinguishing between true needs and wants. When I honestly categorized my coffee shop visits, streaming services, and takeout meals as wants, I realized just how much discretionary spending I was doing while claiming I had no money. The truth was, I had plenty of money. I was just misallocating it dramatically. My first properly categorized budget revealed another surprise. I had been spending almost nothing on my actual needs. The 15% that went to genuine necessities was far below the 50% recommendation because I was cutting corners on things that mattered. I was behind on dental checkups, skipping oil changes, and buying the cheapest groceries possible, all while splurging on non-essentials. Tracking expenses consistently showed me exactly where my money was going for the first time. There's something powerful about seeing your spending habits visualized. Those small daily purchases that seemed insignificant suddenly appeared as massive chunks of my monthly income when grouped together. My daily small coffee purchase was actually costing me over $150 a month. After setting up my categories, I realized I needed to make regular adjustments. The 50-30-20 framework isn't rigid. It's meant to be adapted to your specific situation. As I learned more about my spending patterns, I refined my categories and allocations. Some months required more in the needs category due to seasonal expenses, while others allowed me to put more toward debt repayment. The concept of reviewing and adjusting became fundamental to my success. Unlike my previous all-or-nothing approaches, this system accommodated real life. If I overspent in one category, I didn't abandon the entire budget. I simply adjusted other categories to compensate. This flexibility made the system sustainable when unexpected expenses inevitably arose. I discovered that different tracking methods worked better for different spending categories. For fixed expenses like rent and utilities, automatic tracking through my bank's website was sufficient. For variable expenses like groceries and entertainment, I needed more active tracking. Recognizing these differences helped me create a system that required minimal effort while providing maximum insight. One of the biggest challenges was dealing with high debt payments. Since my minimum credit card payments were already eating up a significant portion of my needs allocation, I had to get creative. I temporarily adjusted my percentages to something closer to 60-20-20 while I focused on reducing those high-interest debts. The framework was flexible enough to accommodate this necessary modification. The categorization process itself was profoundly educational. I found myself questioning purchases in a way I never had before. Is this really a need, or am I just telling myself it is? This simple question transformed my approach to spending and helped me identify the psychological drivers behind my financial decisions. Identifying my true financial priorities was liberating. I realized I'd been spending money on things I didn't actually value while neglecting areas that mattered to me. By aligning my spending with my actual priorities, I not only saved money, but also experienced greater satisfaction with my purchases. The hardest part, cutting back without cutting out. That satisfaction with my aligned purchases came with a brutal reality check. I needed to slash my wants, spending from 85% to just 30% of my income. Here's the paradox that kept me up at night. How could I possibly cut back so dramatically without cutting out everything that made life enjoyable? What I discovered next completely changed my relationship with money. Looking at the raw numbers was honestly terrifying. I needed to reduce my wants spending by 55 percentage points. More than half of my entire previous lifestyle had to go. The first few days of facing this reality, I cycled between denial, anger, and occasionally a weird numbness about the whole situation. I'd stare at my budget spreadsheet thinking, this isn't just a financial adjustment. This is completely reinventing how I live. My apartment was the first big decision. I was paying way too much for a trendy downtown location with amenities I rarely used. Moving to a place just 15 minutes further from the city center cut my rent by nearly 25%. Was it less convenient? Sure, but I quickly realized that I'd been paying hundreds extra each month for a fancy address I mostly used to impress others on social media. The kitchen became my new best friend and unexpected therapist. Instead of ordering delivery 4 or 5 times a week, I started cooking at home. The first few attempts were honestly disastrous. Note to self, caramelizing onions takes longer than 2 minutes. But within a few weeks, I discovered that meal prepping on Sundays gave me both budget control and a calming weekend ritual that actually reduced my stress. Those $15 to $20 lunch deliveries had been costing me nearly $400 a month. Money I now partially redirected to buying quality ingredients that lasted all week. Social life was where I expected the biggest pain, but it became the most surprising transformation. Instead of automatically agreeing to expensive dinners or cocktails, I started suggesting alternatives. Hiking at a nearby state park, hosting potluck movie nights, or meeting for coffee instead of drinks. When friends suggested expensive outings, I practiced a phrase that felt impossible at first. That sounds fun, but it's not in my budget right now. How about we? The first few times I said it, my voice actually shook. The fear of judgment was overwhelming. I imagined friends thinking I was cheap, or worse, pitying me. But implementing the value-based spending concept became my secret weapon. This approach helped me identify which expenses actually brought me joy, and which ones I was spending on purely out of habit or social pressure. I discovered that browsing boutiques with friends didn't actually make me happy. The connection with them did. So why not suggest a free alternative that offered the same social benefit? I'll never forget the first time I was completely honest with my friend group about my financial situation. We were planning a weekend trip that would have cost nearly $500. Instead of making up an excuse about being busy, I took a deep breath and explained that I was working on paying down debt and couldn't afford the trip. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then one friend said, "I've been struggling too, but was afraid to say anything. Should we do something local instead?" That moment of vulnerability turned into a genuine conversation about money, something we'd never had before despite years of friendship. Coming clean about my financial boundaries actually strengthened my relationships. Friends started suggesting affordable activities without prompting, and I discovered who valued my company versus who only wanted a spending partner. One friend even confessed she was relieved because she'd been struggling to keep up with our group's spending habits too. Finding creative alternatives to expensive habits became a game rather than a punishment. I replaced my $75 monthly gym membership with free YouTube workout videos and a $20 set of resistance bands. Instead of hitting expensive happy hours, I learned to make craft cocktails at home for a fraction of the price. My $14 movie theater tickets became library movie rentals and homemade popcorn. Each substitution saved money while often providing a better experience. The 48-hour rule became another powerful ally in my spending transformation. Whenever I felt the urge to buy something non-essential, I'd wait at least 2 days before purchasing. This simple waiting period eliminated about 80% of my impulse purchases. Items that seemed absolutely necessary on Tuesday often lost their appeal by Thursday. One of my most effective experiments was implementing a no-spend week each month. For 7 days, I wouldn't spend a single dollar on non-essentials. No coffee shops, no online shopping, no takeout. The first time was painful, but by the third month, these weeks became refreshing reset buttons that helped me appreciate what I already owned. Social media posed a unique challenge. My feeds were filled with influencers promoting products and friends sharing their latest purchases. Each scroll session left me feeling deprived and resentful of my new budget. The solution wasn't deleting apps entirely, but curating them intentionally. I unfollowed accounts that triggered spending urges and instead found communities focused on financial independence, minimalism, and budget-friendly creativity. Even with these strategies, there were days when financial stress felt overwhelming. A study I discovered revealed that nearly 25% of millennials have felt physically ill due to financial stress. Knowing I wasn't alone in these feelings helped me be kinder to myself during difficult moments. I learned to recognize when I was making financial decisions from an emotional place and developed techniques to pause and reset. When temptation struck, I'd ask myself 3 questions. Will this purchase still matter to me in a month? Does it align with my top priorities? Is there a more affordable way to meet this same need? These questions help me distinguish between momentary wants and meaningful expenditures that deserved a place in my 30% allocation. The biggest revelation came about 4 months into my new budget. I realized I wasn't actually missing most of what I'd cut out. My apartment was smaller, but cozier. Cooking at home led to healthier eating habits. Free outdoor activities improved my physical and mental health more than expensive entertainment ever had. The things I thought were essential to my happiness turned out to be peripheral, while what truly mattered, meaningful connections, creative expression, and personal growth, cost very little. This doesn't mean the transition was easy. There were times I slipped up, like splurging on concert tickets or a new outfit when I was having a particularly rough day. But instead of letting these moments derail my entire budget like before, I'd adjust the following week and move forward. Progress replaced perfection as my goal. One unexpected challenge was explaining my new lifestyle to colleagues and acquaintances. When I declined lunch outings or didn't participate in office gift exchanges, I worried about seeming antisocial or stingy. I developed a simple script. I'm working towards some financial goals right now, so I'm being more intentional about my spending. Most people respected this boundary, and some even shared their own financial struggles once I opened the door to the conversation. The most surprising outcome was how my relationship with wants fundamentally changed. Before, acquiring things or experiences gave me a quick hit of happiness that quickly faded. Now, I found deeper satisfaction in aligning my spending with my values. When I did decide to spend on something special, tackling the debt, the 20% that changed everything. As my relationship with my spending habits evolved, there was still a massive elephant in the room, the $27,452 of debt that loomed over me like a dark cloud. What I didn't realize was that dedicating just 20% of my income toward this seemingly insurmountable number would create a psychological turning point that money experts rarely discuss, the moment when debt transforms from your master to your employee. The beauty of the 50-30-20 rule was that it gave me permission to allocate a realistic portion of my income to debt repayment. I committed to putting the entire 20% savings portion toward my debt mountain initially. That came out to about $740 each month. Not a life-changing amount, but consistent enough to make actual progress. When I first ran the numbers, I nearly abandoned the whole plan. At $740 per month, it would take me approximately 3.5 years to pay off everything. 3.5 years. That felt like an eternity when I was used to instant gratification. But my alternatives were either continuing the cycle of minimum payments, which would take decades, or trying another extreme budget that I'd inevitably abandon. So I reluctantly committed to the long game. I needed a strategy to maximize that 20%, and after researching different approaches, I landed on the debt avalanche method. This approach focuses on tackling debts with the highest interest rates first, while making minimum payments on everything else. The math made sense. By eliminating the most expensive debts first, I'd save more money on interest payments over time. My system was simple but effective. I created a debt priority list ranking all 5 credit cards by interest rate. Then I made minimum payments on 4 cards and threw every remaining penny from my 20% allocation at the highest interest card. Those interest rates were brutal, many hovering around 24 to 25%, so attacking them strategically was crucial. I created a visual debt tracker on my wall, carefully hidden whenever anyone visited, with a series of empty thermometers I could fill in as each card's balance decreased. The very act of coloring in that progress became a small monthly celebration. Nothing fancy, just a visual reminder that I was making headway, even when it felt painfully slow. What surprised me most was how this approach completely transformed my relationship with unexpected expenses. Before, a surprise car repair or medical bill would completely derail me emotionally and financially. Now I had a system to handle them. If absolutely necessary, I'd temporarily divert some funds from my debt repayment to cover emergencies, then get right back on track the following month without spiral of shame and abandonment. About 4 months in, I hit my first major test. My laptop died completely, and I needed a replacement for work. In the past, I would have immediately charged a top-of-the-line replacement to my credit card. This time I tapped the brakes. I determined the minimum specs I needed, bought a refurbished model at half the price, and paid for it by reducing my debt payment by 30% for 2 months. Was it my dream laptop? No. Did it get the job done without adding to my debt? Absolutely. The psychological benefits of watching those numbers consistently decrease each month cannot be overstated. Even when progress seemed glacially slow, seeing that I'd paid off another $500 or $1,000 created a snowball effect of motivation. The debt avalanche method provided a mathematical structure, but the real power came from the consistent, visible progress. 6 months in, I noticed an interesting shift in my mindset. I stopped thinking of my debt as this shameful, overwhelming monster, and began viewing it as simply a mathematical problem I was systematically solving. This cognitive reframing removed much of the emotional weight I'd been carrying. Then came the breakthrough I hadn't anticipated. After 6 months of consistent, on-time payments, I finally gathered the courage to call my credit card companies directly. With my payment history as leverage, I asked each one if they would consider lowering my interest rates. I expected rejection, but remarkably, 2 companies agreed to reduce my rates, one from 24.99% to 19.99%, and another from 23.99% to 17.99%. These rate reductions might seem modest, but they dramatically accelerated my progress. On my highest balance card, the interest reduction alone saved me nearly $70 per month, money that now went straight to principal instead of interest. This was the first time I'd experienced the power of proactively negotiating with creditors, something I wish I'd known years earlier. The conversation with my creditors was easier than I anticipated. I simply called the customer service line, asked to speak with someone about my interest rate, and explained my situation honestly. I've been making consistent payments for 6 months and am committed to paying off my balance. I've received offers from other cards with lower rates. Would you be willing to lower my rate to help me pay this debt off faster? Not every creditor said yes, but enough did to make a meaningful difference in my repayment timeline. This success gave me the confidence to renegotiate rates again every 6 months, gradually securing even better terms. Each negotiation accelerated my progress further. I also discovered the power of mixing debt repayment strategies. While the avalanche method, focusing on highest interest first, made the most mathematical sense, I borrowed an element from the debt snowball method, which emphasizes paying the smallest debts first. When one of my smaller cards was nearly paid off, I sometimes diverted extra funds to eliminate it completely, just for the psychological win of having one fewer debt to manage. These small victories created powerful momentum. Each paid-off card meant one less minimum payment, one less statement to open anxiously, and more funds available to attack the remaining balances. The first time I cut up a completely paid-off credit card, I felt a rush of accomplishment I hadn't experienced in years. My tracking system evolved too. Beyond the wall chart, I created a simple spreadsheet showing my total debt, monthly payments, and a projection of when I'd be debt-free. Each month, I'd update the actual numbers and watch my projected freedom date inch closer. Sometimes I'd even make micro adjustments to my budget to find an extra $20 or $30 for debt repayment, just to see that freedom date move up by a few more days. What I hadn't expected was how this consistent progress would affect my overall sense of financial confidence. After nearly a year of following the 50-30-20 rule, I started to trust myself again with money decisions. The shame that had paralyzed me for years began to dissolve, replaced by a growing sense of financial empowerment. This journey wasn't without setbacks. There were months when unexpected expenses forced me to dial back my debt payments temporarily. During one particularly rough period, I had to redirect some funds to cover medical expenses. But unlike before, these setbacks didn't trigger a complete abandonment of my system. I simply adjusted temporarily and got back on track as soon as possible. By the 14-month mark, I'd fully paid off 2 of my 5 credit cards and made significant progress on a third. My total debt had decreased by nearly 40%. And thanks to my improved credit score from consistent payments, I qualified for a balance transfer offer that let me move my highest remaining balance to a card with 0% interest for 18 months. This balance transfer strategy became my next acceleration point. By temporarily eliminating interest on my largest remaining balance, every penny of my payment went directly to reducing principal. However, I was careful not to see this as solving my debt problem. Too many people balance transfer their way into a false sense of security, only to rack up new debt on the newly cleared cards. Instead, I cut up the paid-off cards and kept them out of my digital wallets to avoid temptation. The most surprising aspect of this entire process was how my perception of the 20% allocation shifted over time. What initially felt like an impossible sacrifice eventually became a non-negotiable part of my financial life, money that was simply not available for spending. This mental accounting trick helped me avoid the constant internal negotiation about whether I could afford to skip a debt payment for something else. The mental health transformation. Beyond the spreadsheets and payment plans, a silent revolution was happening in my mind. That constant knot in my stomach when checking the mail, the 3 a.m. panic attacks about money, they didn't disappear overnight. But what happened to my anxiety levels after just 3 months of consistent budgeting shocked even my therapist. When I first created my 50-30-20 budget, I'd literally break into a cold sweat every time I opened the spreadsheet. Each number felt like an accusation. Each calculation seemed to scream, "Look at the mess you've made of your life." That first month, I'd procrastinate my weekly check-ins until Sunday night, then rush through them with my heart racing just to get it over with. But something unexpected started happening around week 6. The anxiety didn't spike as high when I sat down with my budget. By month 3, I actually found myself looking forward to my weekly money dates. Why? Because for the first time I was seeing patterns instead of chaos. The consistency of the 50-30-20 structure created something I hadn't experienced in years: financial predictability. When you've lived in financial chaos for so long, simply knowing what's coming next feels like a superpower. I could anticipate expenses instead of being ambushed by them. I could plan responses instead of just reacting in panic. The transformation wasn't just emotional, it was physical. My body had been sending distress signals for years that I'd attributed to just being stressed or working too hard. But as my financial situation stabilized, so did my physical symptoms. The tension headaches that had become my constant companion started fading away. My digestion improved dramatically once I wasn't constantly producing stress hormones. One night about 4 months in, I realized I had slept through the entire night without waking up to worry about money. It was such a novel experience that I actually noted it in my journal. By month 6, uninterrupted sleep had become my new normal. The impact this had on my overall well-being cannot be overstated. I was finally functioning on a full tank instead of running on fumes. The most profound shift happened in how I talked to myself about money. Before the 50-30-20 rule, my internal dialogue was brutal. "You're so stupid with money. You'll never fix this. Everyone else has their finances together except you." The shame was paralyzing. But as I consistently made progress, I developed what my research later told me was financial self-compassion. Instead of beating myself up over past mistakes or current setbacks, I learned to approach my financial journey with the same kindness I'd offer a friend. When I overspent one weekend, instead of spiraling into "I'm hopeless" territory, I'd think, okay, that happened, what triggered it, and how can I plan better next time? This self-compassion wasn't something that came naturally. I had to actively practice replacing those harsh thoughts with more constructive ones. I made mistakes when I didn't know better, but now I'm taking responsible steps forward. One setback doesn't erase months of progress. I'm learning, and learning includes mistakes. The most counterintuitive part of my recovery was realizing I needed to stop dealing with my financial stress alone. For years, I'd hidden my money troubles from everyone, convinced that revealing them would make me a social pariah. The shame of financial failure felt too heavy to share. My first conversation about my debt was physically painful. My hands shook as I told my closest friend about my situation over coffee. I was certain she'd judge me, or, worse, pity me. Instead, she shared her own financial anxieties, ones I'd never suspected because she, too, had been maintaining a facade of financial wellness. That single conversation broke the dam. Over the next few months, I carefully opened up to a small circle of trusted friends. Not to borrow money or make excuses, but simply to be honest about my journey. The support system that emerged was life-changing. These conversations normalized my experience and showed me I wasn't alone in my struggles. One friend shared budgeting spreadsheets that had helped her. Another became my accountability partner for no-spend challenges. A third offered emotional support when I felt discouraged by seemingly slow progress. By breaking the silence around money, I'd created a community of support I never knew was possible. This network helped reduce my isolation and the shame that had been compounding my financial anxiety for years. Research confirms this experience. Open conversations about money with trusted friends create a support system that alleviates feelings of isolation and shame associated with financial struggles. The improvements in my mental health weren't just making me feel better. They were making me function better. My concentration at work improved dramatically once I wasn't constantly distracted by financial worry. Creative solutions came more easily. My performance reviews improved because I could actually focus on my job instead of mentally calculating which bill I could postpone. The sense of control extended beyond my finances. Once I proved to myself I could manage my money, other areas of my life that had seemed overwhelming suddenly felt more manageable too. I cleaned out the closet I'd been avoiding for years. I finally scheduled the dental appointment I'd been putting off. I started a small workout routine. Each small victory reinforced my growing sense of agency. What I found most interesting was how my relationship with the future changed. When you're drowning in debt, you live entirely in the painful present, or you obsess about the past mistakes that got you there. The future feels like a luxury you don't deserve to think about. But as the 50-30-20 rule helped me gain traction, I started allowing myself to look forward again. Not just financially, but in all aspects of my life. I began setting goals that had nothing to do with debt repayment, professional aspirations, travel dreams, and personal growth objectives. This forward-thinking mindset was perhaps the most healing aspect of all. The structured approach to budgeting gave me a framework for addressing my anxiety that was both practical and psychological. Each time I made a payment toward my debt, I wasn't just reducing the balance. I was actively confronting the very thing that had caused me so much distress. This sense of taking direct action against the source of my anxiety was incredibly empowering. My experiences aligned perfectly with research, showing that addressing financial anxiety through structured budgeting and financial planning provides a sense of control and purpose, replacing feelings of hopelessness with actionable steps toward recovery. Even my relationships improved once I wasn't constantly hiding financial stress. The energy I had previously spent maintaining a facade could now be invested in authentic connections. Friends noticed I seemed more present and less distracted. Dating became less stressful when I wasn't constantly worried about how to afford outings or hide my financial situation. I could be honest about preferring less expensive activities without making up excuses. The psychological benefits didn't stop at stress reduction. My self-esteem gradually rebuilt as I demonstrated to myself that I could be trusted with money. Each week I stuck to my budget was evidence contradicting the harsh narrative I'd constructed about being bad with money. Each debt payment reinforced my identity as someone who follows through on commitments. I won't pretend there weren't setbacks and difficult days. Financial recovery isn't linear, and neither is the mental health improvement that accompanies it. Some weeks I'd feel on top of the world, and others I'd spiral into old thought patterns of shame and anxiety. But overall, the trend moved steadily upward. What surprised me most was that I started enjoying the process itself. Tracking my decreasing debt balances became a source of genuine satisfaction. Discovering creative ways to enjoy life within my 30% wants allocation became a fun challenge rather than a deprivation. Finding tricks to stretch my grocery budget without sacrificing nutrition became a point of pride. The psychological transformation went beyond just feeling less anxious. I was developing an entirely new relationship with money. Instead of seeing it as a source of stress or a measure of my worth, money became simply a tool, one that I was learning to use effectively. This neutrality toward money itself was healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. By month 9, people in my life were commenting on the change they saw in me. "You seem lighter," a colleague mentioned. "You laugh more," said another friend. I hadn't realized how visibly my financial stress had been weighing on me until it began to lift. The results, 1 year later. Those comments about me seeming lighter weren't just about my mood. My financial burden was literally shrinking by thousands of dollars. What happens when you stick with a budgeting system for a full year? Most people quit after a few months, but the transformation in my financial reality went far beyond what I could have imagined when I first started this journey. Let me pull back the curtain and show you exactly what happened after 12 months of consistently following the 50-30-20 rule. The numbers tell a story more powerful than words ever could. My credit card debt, that mountain that once seemed impossible to climb, had shrunk by a whopping 60%. My credit score, which I was once terrified to check, jumped by 95 points. And perhaps most meaningful of all, I had finally started an emergency fund, something I previously dismissed as impossible. I still remember the first time I logged into my accounts and didn't immediately feel that familiar knot in my stomach. Instead, I felt something entirely new: pride. Sure, I still had debt remaining. This wasn't a magical overnight fix, but for the first time I could clearly see the path to complete freedom. It wasn't a question of if anymore, but when. Let me share a side-by-side comparison that still blows my mind. In month 1, I was barely making minimum payments, had zero savings, and my credit score was in the poor range. Fast forward to month 12, and I was making substantial payments toward my principal, had nearly $3,000 in emergency savings, and my credit score had jumped into the good category. The transformation wasn't just about numbers. It was about possibilities. My monthly budget evolved dramatically, too. In those first weeks, every single category was a struggle. I constantly shifted money around, trying to patch holes in my financial boat. By month 12, my budget had stabilized completely. I knew exactly how much I needed for groceries, utilities, and transportation. My wants spending had found a comfortable rhythm within that 30% allocation, and I no longer felt deprived or restricted. What's fascinating is how my spending habits transformed. In month 1, my grocery bill was all over the place. I was either overspending or underspending drastically. By month 12, I had consistent grocery costs because I'd learned to meal plan and shop strategically. My restaurant spending dropped by 75%, not because I never ate out, but because I made it special and intentional rather than a default when I was too tired to cook. As my highest interest debt cards started getting paid off, I made a strategic shift in my approach. I modified my percentages to what I called a 50-20-30 rule, keeping 50% for needs but increasing my savings to 20% while maintaining 30% for wants. This adjustment allowed me to build financial resilience through my emergency fund while still making progress on my remaining debt. This increased focus on savings came directly from what I learned about financial stability. According to financial experts, having 3 to 6 months of living expenses saved provides a crucial buffer against unexpected challenges. This emergency fund became my financial shock absorber, protecting my progress from life's inevitable surprises. The improvement in my credit score opened doors I didn't even know existed. My employer offered a 401k matching program that I'd ignored for years because I couldn't imagine contributing anything. With my new budget, I was able to capture this free money for the first time. It felt surreal to be thinking about retirement when just a year earlier, I couldn't think past the next bill due date. My rental options expanded dramatically too. With my improved credit, I qualified for apartments that previously rejected my applications. Property managers could see I was financially responsible now, and some were even willing to waive security deposits or offer better terms. These indirect benefits of better credit added up to significant savings I hadn't anticipated. What truly amazed me was learning how much money my improved credit score would save me in the long run. Research shows that individuals with higher credit scores can access significantly lower interest rates on everything from car loans to mortgages. Over the lifetime of a typical mortgage, this difference can translate to tens of thousands of dollars saved. My financial transformation wasn't just fixing the past, it was investing in my future. The education component of this journey proved invaluable. Studies show that people who receive financial education are significantly more likely to maintain positive financial behaviors, like budgeting and saving. The knowledge I gained through implementing the 50-30-20 rule wasn't just about percentages. It was about understanding how money works and how my choices impact my financial health. I became one of those people who actively tracks spending and adjusts budgets regularly. Research confirms this proactive approach dramatically increases the likelihood of achieving financial goals. By consistently monitoring where my money was going, I could quickly identify unnecessary expenses and redirect those funds toward debt repayment and savings. The system evolved with my changing financial situation. As certain debts disappeared, I redistributed those payments to the remaining balances, creating a snowball effect that accelerated my progress. When I received my tax refund, I didn't splurge as I would have in the past. I strategically applied it to my highest interest remaining debt, while still setting aside a small portion for something enjoyable. My relationship with money underwent a fundamental shift. I stopped seeing budgeting as a punishment and started viewing it as a tool for creating the life I wanted. The 50-30-20 rule gave me permission to enjoy my money while still being responsible. I no longer felt guilty about spending on things that truly mattered to me because I knew it was planned for and wouldn't derail my progress. 1 year into my journey, I noticed my financial decisions had become almost automatic. The mental gymnastics required to justify unnecessary purchases had disappeared. I naturally paused before impulse buys and could easily distinguish between genuine needs and momentary wants. This mental clarity around money was perhaps the most surprising benefit of all. The confidence this system gave me extended beyond finances. I began negotiating in other areas of my life, asking for a raise at work, which I got, finding better deals on insurance, and even questioning medical bills when they seemed incorrect. The skills I developed through managing my money transferred to all aspects of my life. I also discovered that tracking my progress became genuinely enjoyable. Each month, I would update my spreadsheets and charts, visibly seeing the debt decrease and savings increase. This regular feedback loop created a powerful motivation cycle. Seeing progress made me want to continue, which created more progress, and so on. The 50-30-20 rule wasn't just a temporary fix for my financial crisis. It became the foundation of my entire approach to money. Even as my income increased and my debt decreased, I maintained the core principle of balance between needs, wants, and future security. The percentages might shift slightly based on life circumstances, but the framework remained solid. What started as a desperate attempt to stop drowning in debt had transformed into a sustainable lifestyle that actually brought me joy. The simple act of knowing where my money was going and having a plan for every dollar eliminated the background anxiety that had been my constant companion for years. What I've learned through this journey is that financial secrets don't just harm our bank accounts, they erode our mental health too. Did you know that 41% of American adults have hidden accounts, debt, or spending habits from their partners? Financial honesty isn't just about money, it's about our well-being. The truth is, anyone can recover from financial mistakes. I've seen countless stories of people who've overcome situations far worse than mine. They didn't get there overnight. Financial recovery is a gradual process that demands patience and discipline. Setting realistic goals and tracking your progress keeps you motivated on tough days. Remember this. Your financial situation is just one part of your story, not your entire identity. The courage to face your money problems honestly is the first step toward freedom. Whether you're tackling mountain-sized debt or just trying to get organized,